Well, alright, gang. Let's return to it. So, please put your TikTok in the upright and locked position. Let us begin once again. It's another beautiful day. Let's head outside and talk about state and local forestry, rec management chunks of the Mosaic. And I'll be around for questions at the end of class. Okay. Let's rock and roll. We should be able to over at the office, yeah. Over here in the shade of the big tree. Okay, so, I don't know, just seems like it was nicer to be out here than inside, so hopefully that's alright. If you guys want to sit in the hopefully less dewy, wet chunks of grass over there, that's cool. Otherwise, just kind of stand and hang out. Alright, so we've been going through this whole Mosaic concept and trying to get a sense of what kind of agencies and organizations, what kind of job titles are doing forest and outdoor recreation management out beyond just like the National Park Service, which is kind of it's not really the stereotype. I mean, it's what they do, but it's also only one color in a very detailed and vibrant mosaic, if we can push the metaphor that far. So, at the state level, we have kind of all of the wildlife management organizations. We have all of the conservation organizations, which may or may not be the same agency at the state level as the wildlife management org. We also have typically a state park organization as well. So just like how we have the federal, so not state level, but federal Fish and Wildlife Service doing hundreds of millions of recreation visit management just alongside the national park. The same thing holds true for pretty much every state, except at the state level, a lot of those different agencies that would be separate at the federal level, they tend to get collapsed together a little bit. So the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is kind of the big show in town for the state of Illinois. Missouri, right across the river, very similar kinds of ecosystems, habitats, landscapes, geology, and so forth. They have a pretty different political setup, which means that they have a pretty different setup for managing parks and forests and other state recreation-oriented opportunities and venues. Over there they have, it's like a fraction of 1 cent for each dollar that's spent on things like soda pop, and chips and stuff like that. So just like kind of a vice tax, not on, cigarettes and fast women or whatever, but more just like junk food, stuff like that. A fraction of a penny out of each dollar of those purchases goes to fill the state's wildlife, habitat, recreation, hunting, fishing, all that stuff. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, which is crazy when you think about it just being a fraction of a percent of like junk food tax and so forth. So that is a critical difference between how Missouri and Illinois do stuff. And so the Illinois Department of Natural Resources gets a bunch of work done, but there's never really enough like full funding. There's not the same kind of steady revenue stream, sort of counting on people to have bad food and stuff like that. And so several years ago, when the state of Illinois around 2015 to 2017 was in just dire straits, for 2 years the state legislature here in Illinois didn't pass a budget resolution. So the state was basically not funded for 2 years. And in that time, because IDNR is relatively small, not as well funded as some other states, folks like conservation officers had a really hard time. If you were the superintendent of an Illinois state park, you would see pretty much all of your staff furloughed or laid off. So a furlough is like a temporary layoff where you just stop working for a while, but you're not fired or anything. They just can't pay you, so you don't have to come into work. The state university system had to furlough everybody for a while. Most of the professors just kept right on teaching and stuff like that because it didn't seem fair to the students. It was rough. And that's never been a thing in Missouri in recent memory, and it's not likely to be a thing in Missouri in upcoming years, just whatsoever, because of that stable tax funding source. So every state does the same kind of stuff that the federal government's doing through all these different land management agencies, right? The 6 or 7 that we've talked about. But they each do it in sort of a slightly more individualized way. So Illinois, during that time, to kind of make ends meet and keep parks open and functional, they would have like the superintendent over not just one state park, like Giant City State Park, for example. The superintendent over Giant City was also placed in charge of Ferncliff State Park and a third one. So there's one person running 3 state parks with 0 staff, except for one person who was mowing the grass to keep things open at just a basic level. No repairs, no environmental and historic interpretation at historic spots like Giant City Lodge, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Almost 100 years old. I mean, it's an amazing spot. And that's just kind of how it went for the state of Illinois. Now, other states did not have that particular budgeting issue, and so things were just completely fine right across the river. And things just kept steaming forward, not a big deal. So, states like Colorado and Wyoming, where a significant portion of the tourism economy is understandably anchored with forest and outdoor recreation specifically, right? They go really, really, really hard. And so at the state level, they have some national quality operations and places to go and enjoy things like elk hunting, for example. And it's just a function of Colorado and Wyoming kind of know where their bread is buttered. The Front Range is a beautiful place. The Rocky Mountains are a beautiful place, of course. And there are a bunch of national forests and national parks in that area that receive tens of millions of visits combined every year. So, all that to say, if you want to do any kind of forestry, including forest and outdoor recreation management, you have tens of thousands of opportunities every year across the federal government to do that, to jump in as a recreation technician or a trail crew member or any of the other million things you could do. And you also have 50 states to send basically the same application, reformatted a little bit for the state system, to see which other spots you can get a foot in the door in. The state of Hawaii, for example, has a lot of forest and outdoor recreation going on. It's also shore-based and marine stuff too. And every year, folks go out there, and if you need to spend a little bit of time down in Hawaii, just kind of figuring out how your career's shaping up, you could do worse than Hawaii, right? And so forth. So across all of these state organizations, there's just so much going on. IDNR, just by the numbers, 52 state parks, 5 state forests, 42 additional fish and wildlife areas, 11 natural areas, 19 recreation areas, which are, again, they tend to be closer to urban areas, mostly Chicago and Springfield. They're heavily developed, kind of armored up, so they can have a lot of visitors, recreation visits per year without a lot of environmental damage, but you can do stuff a little bit more intensively at a recreation area than at a state park, for example. There's also a state prairie and 3 state trails. So there's a lot going on, even in a state like Illinois, where compared to places like Colorado and Wyoming, we have relatively less horsepower. We have fewer bullets in the magazine, so to speak, in Illinois versus some other states. That's not to say that there are no opportunities for you here. I don't know if any of you guys and gals are planning on staying relatively close to home. Maybe you have a loved one or family members that you don't hate, and it'd be nice to not live 12, 14 hours away in Colorado. If that's your thing, right, there's always stuff coming up in the state of Illinois, but there are relatively few opportunities compared to some other states. So a lot of our students end up working in Colorado. Maybe they get on with a fire crew, for example. The single way that you're going to get into the Forest Service as a temp seasonal student hire, like before you graduate, the one way that that's going to happen in the next 12 months, as according to the Forest Service, is through fire management. Their entire budget is locked up in fire. They can't do anything else this year, period. And that's blowing a lot of minds, but it's evidence of kind of how forest resource management is going at the federal level. We are just so chained to taking care of and steering the ship in a better direction with respect to wildland fire management that it's the entire agency's mission now, at least for this coming year. The director of the Forest Service just sent out that memo. Have you guys been hearing that in any of your classes? Good. All right. That's big news. And it's not a bad thing. It's just different than past years. So as long as everybody's aware of that, good to go. Anyway, yeah, so Illinois State. Other states have... I don't mean to take a dump on Illinois. There's just 50 different versions of state systems. So there's a lot of contrast relative to the amount of comparison. The state of Vermont has a bunch of relatively very small state-supported recreation opportunities because states like Vermont and countries like Ireland, for example, have laws on the books that say if you're out just hiking around on like a Saturday or a Sunday and you are hiking through and look out and not staying in that spot, like overnight, for example, you can walk across people's private land and not get in trouble for that. Like, you're not trespassing if you're just there sort of out rambling to enjoy a beautiful Vermont or Irish hike kind of thing. That's pretty cool. Not all states have that. Illinois has some pretty cool legislation on the books about trying to figure out how do we get horseback riders who need comparatively very large amounts of trail mileage to enjoy in the same unit of time, right? Horses just go pretty far relatively fast compared to a walking human being. And so for 100 horseback riders versus 100 hikers, you would just need a lot more miles of trail to satisfy those horseback riders. Not a big deal. So Illinois does have efforts to make sure it's legal for horseback riders to be able to ride around open mode, safe for horses areas, for example, at the edge of farm fields. So you can't go just anywhere with a horse automatically, but at least places that are cleared and relatively safe for horses, and that the farmer isn't really using those grassy strips for anything other than stuff like trapping chemical overspray runoff before it gets into the river kind of thing. Nutrient leaching and pesticide, herbicide leaching management. It's just sort of open space that's not being used for anything else actively. It's just providing that passive ecosystem benefit. So let's make it legal for horseback riders to just enjoy those. And you can put together a lot of miles of sort of farm edge or margin trails throughout the state of Illinois, right? If any of us came from kind of the corn and soy desert north of us, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like if your dog runs away, you can watch it go for 3 days. Like there's not a lot in between you and the next thing. So why not be able to ride a horse around on that legally? And if unfortunately you or the horse gets injured, then that landowner is not liable for that because they're already providing you a free benefit. And the concern would be, well, if I let somebody onto my land and they fall down an old well hole that I didn't even know was there, and their family sues me for wrongful death or something like that, and I had no idea what was going on, I didn't even know the person was there, right? State, you got to protect me from that liability. And so states kind of one by one, activity by activity, hikers up in Vermont, horseback riders in Illinois, we're starting to see more legislation like that. So that's not something that's really a state park or anything like that, but it's a state-run program or initiative or law on the books to sort of practically make stuff that we're sort of already providing and managing for otherwise anyway. It just makes it available, and it's a much more efficient use of our lands. So now we have hundreds of thousands of miles of verge to ride our horses around on for free. That's a pretty good deal, right? Especially for a state like Illinois, which has, some issues compared to other states funding certain parts of forest and land management. All right. At the local government level, so now we're talking about like counties. So let's talk about like Cook County Forest Preserve or Forest Preserve DuPage County, something like that. Put a little stank on that DuPage County. Anyway. Or things like local municipal, so City of Carbondale or Town of Carbondale. We have the Park District here. So your tax dollars, which are relatively very high in Jackson County and inside of the Carbondale city limits, they go to fund a whole bunch of open spaces and programs. There's a lot of not just providing a space to do stuff, but setting up things to do inside of those spaces at the local and municipal level. Right? So if you've ever heard the expression, all politics is local, this is kind of how that goes. You and I, coming up in November, have the capacity to vote in or out funding for programs like things going on in your local parks. Right down the road or a short walk away. So for example, we have the Carbondale Park District, the Life Community Center, spots like Crispus Attucks Park, Parish Park, Evergreen Park. Have any of you guys been to any of these yet? Maybe Evergreen Park, the reservoir down there? We have some pretty awesome things going on. Anybody been to the Arboretum in town?
Last week.
Very good. All right, so what's that like?
Pretty cool.
Bunch of trees?
A lot of trees.
An arboretum, yeah, trees. Excellent.
Bamboo too, a lot of that.
Yeah. So this stuff is here, and it's available to us all the time. Now, there is typically some confusion in any town, Carbondale size or larger, between what is being run publicly by the city of Carbondale, supported by your tax dollars, versus what is run as public green spaces, hiking trails, walking trails, dog parks, stuff like that, that are run by not-for-profit, non-government organizations, or NGOs. So, NGOs here in Carbondale are going to be organizations like Green Earth Incorporated. Green Earth Inc. runs a half dozen or so green spaces all across the city of Carbondale that are essentially slightly more wild or slightly more natural, more forested, more primitive trails than paved trails kind of thing. Park-like areas, or maybe slightly wildland-like areas right here inside of town, right? So there are almost as many Green Earth Incorporated green spaces here in town for you to enjoy and receive real benefits from, and volunteer, get some trail maintenance hours in, stuff like that. Start building some skills for your resume if you want to be on a trail crew someday, for example. And they have quite a bit of participation, a lot of traffic. They are really, really cool. There's a whole bunch of them. All right, so again, we want to think beyond just the city, very localized municipal level, on up and out to things like the county level. So Jackson County doesn't have a whole lot going on with parks, for example. The county is relying on the local municipalities inside of Jackson County to handle things like that, right? So cities have an easier time typically of levying things like new taxes to support a park district, to buy the property, to pay somebody in the park district office to mow the ball fields, to mow the hiking paths, to put down gravel and stuff like that so the paths don't erode too much. And importantly, local municipalities mostly or often have more power to put funding into programming in those parks. So if you've ever seen like your old aunts or uncles going to like a Tai Chi in the parks program every Saturday morning, 6 months out of the year or whatever, that is very commonly a city park program. So they're paying some yoga instructor or Tai Chi instructor or whatever it is to do that. And it takes some level of support to do that. Where national parks and national forests sometimes have entrance fees, city parks typically don't, right? Because we're in and out them, we're around them so often, all the time. Crab Orchard has a pretty expensive tag you got to get for your vehicle. It's what, $150, $175 every year. And if you're parking on the wildlife refuge without that tag, that's a problem, right? So federal level stuff we tend to support by entrance fees and not so much taxes, although a tiny just droplet of our taxes goes to supporting open spaces for recreation at the federal level. At the local level, it's almost wholly our taxes, and there might be a small fee for participating in a specific, more expensive program, but it's kind of the opposite way of doing things, okay? So, city parks do a lot more programming then than your national parks do. Your national parks don't typically have Tai Chi sessions every Saturday at the national park. That's not what people are going there for, and that's not what the fee structure really supports. So instead, there's kind of a difference in feel to it. So some folks who are super interested in being like backcountry rangers, you're mostly pretty much exclusively looking at the federal level for employment. But if you're a forestry person who doesn't hate interacting with people all the time, then you could think about working with Cook County Forest Preserves, or DuPage, or City of Carbondale, or Murfreesboro Parks, or whatever. So a lot of programs and classes showing up at the local level, and because it's much more local, it can be much more tightly fitted or joined to what the local demand is, right? If nobody in Carbondale has ever heard of Tai Chi, well, then that program doesn't get offered. But some fraction of the folks at any random national park are going to be interested in doing Tai Chi, but it might be a relatively small fraction, so the Park Service can't really engage with that so much. But we can sort of tailor those offerings, those programs, to the demand locally much more easily and stuff like that. So if you like planning stuff, if you like leading people through stuff, man, it is all about working local. Okay? Now, there's also private sector commercial forest and outdoor recreation management and stuff like that. So this will be essentially for-profit companies that are providing something. And this is relatively uncommon, except for some things that tend to look or verge pretty hard onto more the tourism side than the outdoor recreation management side. Remember, there's kind of a distinction we're drawing. We have a separate program, Hospitality and Tourism Administration, separate major, for dealing with that kind of stuff. But for we'd be remiss if we weren't mentioning a couple of things. So, for example, there's this old white guy named Ted Turner who made his fortune in like cable television, and he went and took a bunch of that money and started buying up a bunch of like ranch land, prairie land out west. And so he set up places like Vermejo Park Ranch, where you can go and spend a whole lot of money. And back when we hadn't really started, or had just started, the bison repopulation program across the country as a major national partnership between Forest Service, which manages prairies and grasslands, and the National Park Service, which manages core habitat for bison and stuff like that. But we only had a couple 100,000 bison left total out of millions and millions and millions of them across the Great Plains and as far east as eastern Tennessee and stuff like that, and lots of bison in Illinois. The federal agencies had to partner with private organizations like Turner Ranches, which are just super touristy, like dude ranches. You show up there and put on your fake chaps and go ride the horse for 3 hours and then be like, man, worked hard today, let's have steak. And that was kind of the trip. A lot of people want to pay a lot of money to do that. Not my jam, but there you go. The federal government land management agencies, Fish and Wildlife in particular, helping to lead this charge, they partnered with Ted Turner to say, hey, we need more ranch land to essentially grow these American bison populations back from the brink of extinction. And we can't just do it on our national forest, national park land. We're not really geared for essentially a ranching operation like that. So if you're willing to let us use a whole bunch of your pasture land for bison and keep them entirely separate from cattle because they can interbreed and pass just really awful, devastating illnesses back and forth between each other, like brucellosis. If you let us kind of take over some of this cattle land and use it for bison, we're not really going to pay you particularly to do that, but you can have some of the bison that are born out of these massive federally assembled herds. And that was basically almost all of the bison left in existence. There were some tiny bison operations that would, package bison meat up for bison burgers and stuff like that all the way through since the late 1800s, when we started hunting, or when we finally got to the point of hunting them to the brink of extinction. And that was a pretty good deal for Ted Turner, because he got a whole bunch of bison calves that he could raise up and then sell at an extremely high price to the patrons of places like Vermejo Ranch, and charge an absolute arm and leg with the privilege of eating bison. And we all benefited as the American public, because the Park Service isn't really geared for, they don't have the expertise or the facilities really to do large-scale ranch repopulation management. So everybody kind of won in that regard. And these days there's a whole lot more bison. And the situation is now that we can start actually reestablishing entire herds kind of one by one across the country. Pretty cool stuff. But that only happened with a public-private partnership. And that was exceptional back in the day. Other private for-profit land management organizations or companies that do park and wildland management are going to be folks like the not so much the land management side of it, but organizations like Outward Bound or the National Outdoor Leadership School or NOLS. They take folks out, for a couple of $1,000. They'll take you out for 2, 3, 4 weeks up to a couple of months and do adventure recreation with you and guide you and teach you and provide you the equipment and stuff like that as absolutely a forest and outdoor recreation experience where you learn a lot about yourself, you learn a lot about keeping yourself alive in dangerous places, and you kind of grow up, develop a lot real fast and highly effectively, developing that sense of self-efficacy that you can purpose yourself to do something and accomplish it with excellence and safety and lots of hard work, but that's not bad. Okay? So, that side of things, the outfitting and guiding part of forest and outdoor recreation management is almost exclusively private industries. If you think of any of the gear industries, if you're into climbing like Petzl or mountain safety research stuff, so like your carabiners, your harness, crash pads, so-ill climbing holds, that's all a part of forest and outdoor recreation management as well. So, if you don't like how slowly the federal government moves on land management and stuff like that, because we're managing our parks for an infinity time scale, we're not tied to this year's commercial cycle, for example. But if that drives you nuts, you want to work on the private industry side of stuff coming up someday. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a profit incentive. There can be some real good done by specific companies. So, Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. Maybe you guys have heard of the Patagucci brand of clothing or seen somebody with like the Patagonia iconic mountainscape logo on the hat or whatever. That company has committed to saving lots and lots and lots of land and working real hard on climate change using private profit funds to try and sort of move the needle on some of this stuff on a global scale. That's pretty mind-blowing. Now, Yvon Chouinard donated the entire company, or donated all of his holding in the company towards those things into trusts in order to do that, and got a hell of a tax break. Like, he saved his kids $1 billion tax bill for when he passes away. But there's also some good that's going to be done through that. Now, some outdoor recreation companies have zero interest in doing anything to help advance resource protection and so forth, and that's just kind of the pure beating heart of capitalism. Pure is a loaded word. Anyway, so you want to think about what good am I putting into the world beyond pulling in a paycheck if I'm working for a private company, right? There's an ethic, there are real costs involved with running a society through hypercapitalism. But it's not automatically evil. You can use capitalism for good, I guess, theoretically. Anyway, let's talk about the private side of stuff, but the not-for-profit side. So 501c3, charitable organizations, tax-exempt organizations, or C corporations, as they're called, which are companies that are allowed to make a profit, but their mission is to provide a public benefit. So this would be organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy can move as fast as a private for-profit company in its efforts to buy land for conservation, for example. But it's not buying that land so it can flip it at a profit and make a whole bunch of money and pay off a bunch of shareholders. Instead, it's buying that land to hold it, to manage it, to restore it ecologically to a higher level of function and integrity, and in some cases, donate the land to the United States government or other governments. The Nature Conservancy is now a worldwide organization, to donate land that they take over so that it could become the next national park. Because the federal government moves and works so slowly, it can take 50 years for a parcel that is considered to be a park to work its way through Congress's deliberations and polarized, fractious politics and all that nonsense, right? Things are kind of crazy right now, overheated with an election year, as you know. It can take a long time for the federal government to be like, yeah, this place, okay, that's now Saluki National Park. This is pretty awesome. Let's do this thing. So an organization like the Nature Conservancy can step in and buy that land and sit on it for that 50 years or that 5 years or however long the time period is. And just be like, all right, federal government, when you get your shit together, we'll be here for you. We got this. All right? And not-for-profit organizations can accept donations or bequests of land. So like when somebody dies, in their will they can say, all right, I want this land donated to the Nature Conservancy or another organization like it. Ducks Unlimited, any of the Waterfowl Unlimited or National Deer Association, or any of these wildlife and hunting or fishing oriented organizations. That estate or that living donor gets an enormous tax break for the entire value of that land, and so they don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to have the government taking up to half the value of the estate when that person dies, because the value of that land counts for so much against that toll that you're paying back to the government upon death. Okay? So, not-for-profit organizations do a lot of cool work. They have all of the speed of a private for-profit company, and they don't have the we gotta pay our shareholders more this year than we did last year, or otherwise this thing is going belly up and we all have to find new jobs. All right? So private not-for-profit organizations were created by the tax code of the federal government, the IRS, to do a bunch of the stuff that government sucks at. That private industry really can do better, faster, at lower cost, and just as legally as a federal agency does. Okay? So, if you have kind of I want to save the world mindset, but I'm not real sure how I can sort of actualize that or operationalize that into day-to-day, what am I doing today, kind of thoughts. Think about working with a private, not-for-profit organization. They don't tend to pay as much as for-profit industry, but the moral payoff is pretty good. And some of the bigger or sort of longer-running, better organized, not-for-profit agencies and organizations, some of which, again, are transnational, like they are global organizations, World Wildlife Fund, stuff like that, they do pay pretty well. And life is not all about money, but you got to get a roof over your head and put food on the table, right? So these are problems we got to solve. You can make a decent living in any of these. I'm a state employee. I do fine. We just bought a house, and it's not a super huge house or anything, but it's enough for us, me and my wife and our 2 dogs, right? So even as a state employee, you can do all right. You can make it work just fine. Okay? So organizations like Nature Conservancy, their stated mission, not-for-profits have to have a very clear and specific mission for what they're doing. They can't just be like, we're not going to make money, we're not going to make profit. They are allowed to make money, it just can't be paid out to shareholders. So the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to preserve the plants, the animals, and natural communities that represent the diversity of life on Earth by protecting the lands and waters that those species need to survive. So, as of about 10 years ago, they manage and own 117 million acres That's up there with some of our federal agencies. This is a big deal, y'all. Since 1951 only, right? So it's half the age of the National Park Service and managing not quite as many acres. Pretty cool stuff. And they are not primarily a forest recreation organization, but like the Forest Service, forest and outdoor recreation is very compatible with what they are trying to do, right? So they are trying to preserve, with a capital P, animals and natural communities that represent the diversity of life on Earth. This is a genetic bank. This is, for you Warhammer fans, how we preserve our sort of planetary gene seed, all right? And this is an organization that does that and does it very well across over 100 million acres of habitat. So, passive use recreation is A-OK. They're not going to spend millions of dollars putting in enormous trail networks like such and such national park will right next door. But to the extent that you can go sort of ramble across Nature Conservancy land, and if there aren't sensitive species present or fragile species present, well, go hog wild. Go ramble across those 117 million acres. Have a blast. Take lots of photos. Post them online. Tell the story of the amazing places that the Nature Conservancy and others like it are working so hard to preserve. And so everybody wins, right? Everybody wins. You don't have to pay a bunch of money to get into these places. They're not very busy because passive recreation use is not well advertised. So if you're smart enough to go to the Nature Conservancy land right next to a busy national park, it's all the same views without any of the other people coughing COVID on you. Pretty good deal. Now they do stuff like mostly as education and outreach and a way to sort of generate support so people will donate funds so they can do this stuff. The Nature Conservancy does do a bunch of like, they'll organize nature tours and stuff like that, which is active tourism, but they're not trying to be the next Grand Canyon to the extent that they're managing any canyons in the American Southwest. Okay. So, for example, we got the Warm Springs Mountain area of Virginia. It's 9,000 acres. It was established in 2002. A lot of these are going to be donations from very wealthy landowners, and we'll get like a big chunk of land. And then the Nature Conservancy, because they have fairly low operational costs and they're a not-for-profit, they don't have to pay taxes, so they can just kind of play the long game and wait for the parcel right adjacent to one that they just had donated to them, a 9,000 acre chunk of land. They can wait for that next parcel to open up and then work with those landowners to be like, hey, you know, if you want to leave a legacy of land conservation or preservation in this case, we'd like to work with you and your estate lawyer and stuff like that to set up, maybe when you pass away, let's get a bunch of money to your kids, but also let's donate this land to us, and we'll help you work all of that out so that you get the enormous tax break and your kids end up getting more money than they would have otherwise. So there's a lot of ways this can happen. One of those is called a land easement, where somebody can donate most of the rights of a land, a parcel, like the right to build a building on it. They can donate just that right, but not the entire property. So if you have if your family owns, let's say, a 40-acre wooded parcel as part of your farm, you can donate the right to cut timber off of that woodlot, and the right to build any buildings on that woodlot, and the right to cut a road through that woodlot, access, to an organization like the Nature Conservancy, or they'll buy it from you at a smaller rate, because they're not buying all the land. They can't go and set up a whole nature preserve there. They're just buying the right to develop that land, to bulldoze it, to change it, to cut it over and sell off all the timber and stuff like that. And that smaller set of rights is much, much cheaper. So Nature Conservancy can afford to do that kind of thing for a lot of parcels. And then when your family goes to sell that woodlot, the next person that buys it, they can't build any houses on it. They can't cut it over for timber. They have to keep it in habitat for conservation or preservation purposes. And so that land is restricted or encumbered in legalese. So that's pretty cool. Your family can set up a nature preserve and sell off a chunk of the rights to the Nature Conservancy in an easement. An easement is a partial sale of some of the bundle of rights for a property. And then they just sit on those rights and they hold them. They say, all right, next person who wants to buy this land, buy it. Buy it cheaper than you would have otherwise, but you can't put a building on it. And we'll enforce that because that's all right. We bought that. And the world, all of us, get to benefit from that transaction because now that's being managed for habitat and cannot be managed for other stuff. It can't put a strip mall in a place with a land conservation easement on it. So states like Vermont, New Hampshire, a lot of the northern New England states are afforesting. They're regenerating forest, as a lot of those old hill farms from the 16, 17, 1800s are no longer big industrial farm things. They're just small family farms that nobody's farming anymore, so the forest grows back. A lot of that land is being placed in conservation easements. So now, when you're walking from parcel to parcel, just cross country in Vermont, for example, on your day hike out of Burlington or wherever, now you can enjoy a whole bunch of the state that is protected for you. And those landowners still get to live there. They still get to sell off the land to the next person or whatever. But now all of us get to benefit from that privately owned land, somebody's house, somebody's farm, being pretty awesome for hiking. So, in this way, by making it a little bit harder to do some development in specific spots, we can provide millions of new acres of forest recreation and extremely high quality habitat land because it's not getting cut over. It's not getting driven through. It's not all the normal stuff that we do in the town, in the city, but is not compatible with vibrant wildlife and healthy watersheds and older growth, later successional forests and so forth. Okay? Cool. So, we are almost done, but I got to stop in like 2 minutes. So, we'll end on this. The New River Land Trust is a much smaller private, not-for-profit corporation that does exactly this in the state of Vermont. And Illinois has a bunch of land trusts as well. Every state does. There's some national ones, whatever. And what they do is it's just a couple of people who know about real estate, and they buy or accept donation of the right to develop or essentially destroy the habitat of the land. And they just take that and sit on it. And every 10 years or so, they'll just drive by and make sure that whoever now owns that parcel, whether it's the original owner or somebody later, making sure they're not breaking the rules. And in this way, these tiny little not-for-profits with a couple of people can help provide, again, millions and millions of acres across the country in private ownership, but for public recreation benefit. Very cool stuff. Land easements are a relatively new thing in the last 30, 40 years. So your generation and mine are the only one that get to basically enjoy this. It's a new thing, pretty cool stuff. And it's still being tested in the courts when some people aren't happy with it. But that's the way it goes. All right, let's end 30 seconds early. I'm around for questions. Otherwise, we'll head over to my office and get a couple of other class recordings. I'll put those on our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next week. Enjoy. What a perfect weekend to go get some Forest Rec Management Intro extra credit. Wow, it's so pretty out. What a good excuse. Man, see you next time.